Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode we're talking about the Sandman. And if you may or may not be familiar, the Sandman is one of the icons of ECW wrestling, a guy that's pretty much been everywhere and worked at every major company over the last 30 years, but had his biggest success in ECW. And this isn't going to be a full career step-by-step retrospective. We're mostly going to focus on his ECW run and just give the man his flowers. One of the main reasons I wanted to do this video is you may have seen a few months back, I did a video about Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, who was my mother's favorite wrestler when I was a kid. So I wanted to do this because my stepfather, Don, the Sandman, was his favorite wrestler. And Don, he wasn't big into wrestling, much like my mom, she wasn't big into wrestling like I was. But Don would take me to wrestling events because he was a great stepdad. He did a lot of nice things for me and would go out of his way. He's truly one of the greatest people I've ever met. And thinking about this, and we've talked about this several times over the years, I've been thinking, obviously coming out of the holidays, you think of family, you think of past holidays, and unfortunately, my stepfather passed away a little bit over 2 years ago around Thanksgiving. So I was thinking about him a lot, and I thought about the Sandman, and I thought about how even 20 plus years after he first seen the Sandman, he would bring up the story. And I know I'm getting a little bit long-winded here, but I wanted to give you a little bit of a perspective on this. Don had taken myself and my friend Jason to an ECW show, and it was at the Trenton baseball team's stadium. I forget what their name is. I think it was the Trenton Thunder. They were the minor league team for the New York Yankees in Trenton, New Jersey. And where I grew up was basically across the bridge from there. So he had taken the two of us to the show, and this was right at basically what I would consider the peak of ECW, and it was a show that the Sandman showed up, and he had a Budweiser party ball, which if you remember was kind of like, I think it's a quarter keg of beer, but it was in the shape of a ball. You could buy them at every beer distributor or any place that you would buy a keg or anything of that nature. During the course of the night, the Sandman was drinking out of that party ball, and the Sandman got really drunk, which, go figure, right? One of the funniest things that I've ever heard, and one of the best things, and one of the things that myself and my stepdad talked about all the time, was he said during the show, "That's my favorite guy because he's drunker than I am." And if you knew my stepdad, Don, he liked to drink. So for him to say that, it was kind of like paying his respects to a master, hence the name of the video, Drunken Master. And over the years, whenever we would talk, he would bring it up. He'd go, "Remember that time we went to the show and we seen the Sandman and he was drunker than I was?" And we'd get a good laugh out of it because it was just a funny thing. Don had that way about him. He would just say funny things off the cuff. So because of that, this is a somewhat tribute video, kind of making this here to put that smile on my face, to think about the Sandman, think about the ties to my stepfather, and maybe ignite some of those ties that you have with your family, with your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, your best friends, whoever you watched wrestling with or went to wrestling with. With that being said, let's talk about the Sandman. And I want to give the man the flowers he deserves, because a lot of people write the Sandman off as just an entrance and nothing else, but there is so much more to him. Was he a technically sound wrestler on the level of Eddie Guerrero or Dean Malenko of the time? No. Was he solid in the ring and could tell a great, compelling story? Definitely. I think a lot of people discredit his ring work because of the style of brawling matches he had. He was actually really good, and the way he worked fit his character. His character was he was a drunken brawler. Well, let's dial it back to his beginnings. Sandman started in the late 80s as Mr. Sandman, and every time I hear that I think of two things, either the Method Man song or the old Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Or even a third thing that just came to my mind right now, Mr. Sandman from Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. When he started his career, the Mr. Sandman was because he adopted a surfer gimmick. He would wear a wetsuit and carry a surfboard to the ring. And it's almost like he heard people talking about Surfer Sting and said to himself, Surfer Sting, that gets over, hold my beer. and he went 100% into the surfer gimmick. He did have success. Sandman was one of those guys that was a well-known Northeastern independent wrestler that kind of was the top of the cards on the independent shows in the early 90s. He was part of Joel Goodhart's organization, I forget what the name, I think it was TCW, that kind of predated and was the precursor to ECW. When Goodhart ran out of business, Todd Gordon decided to pick up and create Eastern Championship Wrestling, ECW as it would become to be known later on. Sandman was one of the stars of the company, especially very early on. And it wasn't until about 1994, about 2 years into the company, when Sandman and his friend Todd Gordon were having a conversation, and Todd said to him, "Why don't you just be yourself? Yourself is way more entertaining than the character you're portraying." And if you've heard wrestlers talk, a lot of them will say your most successful character comes from you playing yourself dialed up to 11. So he did just that. He got into a feud with his tag team partner, the Iron Man Tommy Cairo, who's another person that quite doesn't get the respect he deserves. He was one of those glue members of the early ECW shows that helped to build the company. They would feud over the Sandman's wife, Peaches, who was Sandman's valet, but in storyline was cheating on him with Tommy Cairo. This is where we first start to see the edgier version of Sandman, the cigarette-smoking, beer-drinking guy that we're all used to. During that feud, there was an incident in Singapore where American kid Michael Fay got arrested, and part of his punishment was to take 10 whacks with a kendo stick, or a Singapore cane. They brought that in as a stipulation, which kind of, again, now we're starting to see the pieces that make the Sandman that we all remember and love. He incorporates that kendo stick, aka the Singapore cane, into his matches going forward. And this part right here isn't necessarily in perfect chronological order. I'm just mentioning some things. Just a little sidebar, and I know I've taken a lot of sidebars already on this video, but I think it adds to the story when I add these things in. About 5 years or so ago, a local record store called FYE For Your Entertainment was shutting down, and me and my friend Gary, which if you watch some of the very, very old videos on this show, Gary was the original co-host with me, and unfortunately due to his job, he could no longer do it, so it became just me. Gary's still one of my best friends. There was no falling out. I talk to him often. Great guy. He just doesn't have the time to do this, or we don't have the times that match up to do this together. I digress. I know we're going on a tangent. So me and Gary were at FYE, and they were going out of business, and everything was reduced price. I had bought a Mother Love Bone compilation set, which was all of the songs that Mother Love Bone ever recorded as one box set for like $5, which was amazing because I like Mother Love Bone. And there was another thing. At the time, they carried kendo sticks, which I had always wanted to buy one for myself because of Sandman. So it was dropped down, I think it was like $4. I left there spending less than $10 on the CD box set and the kendo stick. Well, Gary's known me for over 20 years. We're going out to the car, and you could see the wheels turning in his head, because he already knew what was about to happen. He sees me fumbling with my phone. So on my phone, I queue up Enter Sandman, and he knew right away. He tried to get away, but I caned him. I had to do it. I mean, I had the kendo stick. It was there. Have to break it in. Hit Enter Sandman. Hit him with the cane. Now back to the story about the Sandman. Around this time, the Sandman brought in Woman, which is another person, again, that doesn't get the respect she deserves. I think Woman is one of the best valets of all time. Her work with Sandman and Too Cold Scorpio and ECW, her work with Doom and WCW, she was just great. And I won't talk about the tragedy at her end of her life because everybody's covered that ad nauseum. But I kind of wish that maybe we could stop talking about the other end of that tragedy and start really talking about how great Woman was and start putting a lot of respect on her name. I digress. After that, we get to see a feud which basically helped build one of the biggest stars that ECW ever had, and that's the Sandman's feud with Tommy Dreamer. Prior to the feud, Dreamer was kind of a floundering babyface. He would wear green suspenders to the ring, and the crowd wasn't really liking what he was doing. He gets in a feud with the Sandman, where the Sandman gets blinded, and here's a story for keeping kayfabe for you guys. The Sandman was blinded in kayfabe and did not leave his house for a full month to sell the fact that he was actually blind. He didn't want anyone in public to see him being able to see. Part of their feud, again, the Singapore King comes into it. They have a match where the loser takes 10 whacks. Well, Dreamer lost the match. And you may or may not have seen this, but one of the famous early ECW moments is Dreamer getting hit with the cane and basically saying, "Thank you, sir. May I have another?" Totally bringing the crowd onto his side, becoming sympathetic, becoming the heart and soul of ECW, the guy that was willing to take the punishment that an ECW star would receive. So that helped to launch Tommy Dreamer as being one of the big stars of ECW. The other thing I want to talk about, and I'm not going to bring up all the championships because he has several of them in ECW, but arguably his biggest feud, or definitely his biggest feud, and arguably one of the biggest feuds in ECW history, was the Sandman and Raven, which kind of coincided at the same time with the Tommy Dreamer and Raven feud. There was a lot of overlap in there, and a lot of times the face side of the card was feuding with the entire heel side of the card. Part of what made the Raven feud special were the moments that he had here, where he brought out Tyler, the Sandman's son, and Tyler turned on his dad, where he had Peaches come back. She had been off of ECW TV for over a year, I think almost 2 years at that point, and she sided with Raven. And just the emotional back and forth between the two, the whole angle that everybody talks about where Sandman gets crucified. I mean, it was just groundbreaking stuff that they were willing to take and go to a different level with. Now, continuing on his story with Raven, Raven leaves for WCW. Sandman leaves for WCW about a year later. When he's first brought in, we see some vignettes which I think are some of the best vignettes that WCW ever did, where it's the Sandman basically exposing the fact that Raven's a spoiled rich kid and the Sandman's his rich neighbor. And it has Chris Kanyon gets involved and Chastity. It's great. Trust me, go watch them. They're hilarious. Those vignettes don't really go anywhere. He seems to be off TV for a little bit, and then he's brought in as Hardcore Hack, a name that I absolutely hated. I didn't understand why he couldn't just be the Sand. But from hearing him in interviews later, Hack was a nickname that he always went by, and when he had to choose a different name, that's what he chose. So I've grown to not necessarily love it, but respect it because it's what the man himself wanted. He had a pretty uneventful run in WCW. They didn't really seem to know what to do with him. They didn't know how to market him. They didn't know how to present him other than just a random guy in hardcore matches. He toiled around there for about a year. After that, he went back to ECW, and he made a surprise return at the ECW arena. And I know there's a video of it on YouTube that you could find. Watch that video, and if I could find it, I'm going to put it in the description. Watch the video of his return, because for a building that holds about 1,000 people, that is one of the loudest pops I've ever heard. I mean, this was a Stone Cold level pop. This was a CM Punk coming back at Survivor Series level pop. This is what they used to call a Road Warrior pop. Just an amazing show of respect from the fans to their prodigal son coming back to the company. And he pretty much stayed there for the rest of the ECW run. Now, after ECW, he would go on to wrestle in places like XPW, and make appearances in TNA, and he was always part of some sort of ECW type reunion or hardcore reunion, and really served more as a nostalgia act. Fast forward to 2005. one of the greatest pay-per-views that WWE has ever produced, ECW One Night Stand. They give the opportunity for ECW to shine one last time and to be, in my opinion, the last real ECW show. I know there's been 50 million other reunion shows, and they've tried to revitalize it so many different ways. But the main event of One Night Stand is the Sandman and old friend slash sometimes foe Tommy Dreamer going up against the Dudley Boys. And watching the version on the network without Enter Sandman, without that entrance, it takes so much away from it. The match itself is great. This was ECW, and this was a perfect tribute to ECW. Going from that leads us to about a year later, WWE decides to make ECW a third brand. And even though all of my friends that watched wrestling, everybody I knew that watched wrestling, was saying how much of a train wreck it was going to be, as an ECW guy, as an ECW fan deep down inside, I wanted so bad for that to work. I wanted it to be ECW coming back. Because if you remember at the time, everything that made ECW special was kind of gone from the world of wrestling. The edginess, the wrestling matches, and yes, there were places you could see hardcore matches in CZW, you could see the wrestling clinics in Ring of Honor, but there wasn't one umbrella that had that. And I was hoping against hope that this would work. Unfortunately, as we all know, it didn't. It was what it was. Since that time, he has made sporadic appearances all over the place as, again, just a nostalgia act, which is pretty much what his career has been since 2001, unfortunately. But he's one of the greats, in my opinion. He's one of the guys that really connects with me, even without the connection to my stepfather. The Sandman has that connection that few other wrestlers do. Wrestlers like Dusty Rhodes, Terry Funk, Roddy Piper, Mick Foley, they all resonate with me in a way that very few other people do. Raven, Dreamer, a lot of the old ECW guys. And he was always one of those guys. He's a guy that, again, doesn't quite get the respect that he was deserved. He was a 6-time ECW champion between Eastern Championship Wrestling and Extreme Championship Wrestling. He had one of the great tag teams in ECW history, in my opinion, him and Scorpio. And he was one of the big stars of my favorite company. I absolutely love the Sandman, and there's not enough good I could say about him. Was Enter Sandman a big part of his gimmick? Yes. Was the cane part of his gimmick? Was the beer and the cigarettes part of his gimmick? Yes, it all was. But you could say the same thing about a guy like The Undertaker. Does The Undertaker work as well without his entrance? Probably yes, but it adds to it. Same with the Sandman. Sandman works without the entrance, but it makes it better with it. Just like CM Punk and Cult of Personality. It makes it better when you have that moment. Just like Randy Orton in The Voices, it's a part of who the character is. And for a lot of people to reduce him down to the entrance and nothing much more, they really discredit how great of a storyteller the man was. And still is. Still to this day, if he's wrestling on a card, he's going to put on probably the most entertaining match on that card. And that's basically what I wanted to say with this. Just a tribute to the guy. Just talking about a man that I have immense respect for. I absolutely love the Sandman. If you're not familiar with him, I hope you go back and watch some of his stuff and get a little bit of respect or a different perspective on his career from what I'm saying here. A guy I absolutely love. A guy that's a tie between me and my stepfather. Thank you, Sandman, for everything you've done for pro wrestling. You truly are one of the greats, in my opinion. And thank you to Big Don for being one of the best stepfathers there's ever been, and being a guy I could talk to about anything at any time, and, unconditionally cared about a kid that at times was a pain in the ass, and I'm being honest about myself. So thank you to Don. Thank you to the Sandman. If you made it here to the end, let's smash that like button, share the video, subscribe if you haven't. If you see where it says join, that's how you become a channel member. Becoming a channel member definitely helps me out. It also gets you some perks, like this video is going to be released a day early for channel members to watch. Shout out to Chris. Thank you for being a member, sir. It gets you other special perks like that shout out. Again, it's more to help me to put the money back into the show, buy new equipment, but I digress. If you made it here to the end, let me know a wrestler that ties you to a family member or a friend, someone that you may have watched as a kid, someone that you may have watched as an adult. Maybe you met your significant other in an online wrestling board talking about the greatness of Eddie Guerrero. Or maybe you grew up loving Dustin Rhodes because Dusty Rhodes was your dad's favorite wrestler or your grandma's favorite wrestler, and now your kid, their favorite wrestler is Cody Rhodes. Let me know one of those connections with you guys. Put it down here in the comments. I'd love to see the stories that you have. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been another Heel Heat video.